Finally, question number 4, harmonize 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 7 through 9, with Romans chapter 3, verses 3 through 8. Frankly, I've never thought of these two passages being in conflict with each other. I've never thought of them as even dealing with the same subject. But as you read into it here, you can see where somebody might come away with the idea that there's a possible contradiction here. Let's start with the 2 Corinthians passage, 2 Corinthians chapter 2, chapter 12, I hope. Chapter 12 is what I've got on my notes. We're going with chapter 12 here. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 9. Let's start with verse 7. To keep me from becoming conceited, Paul writes, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, there was a thorn given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. We all know about the thorn in the flesh, why God gave Paul this thorn in the flesh. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And so therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ might rest upon me. Verse 9, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. We all kind of understand that. If we just take that as a standalone idea, yes, we all struggle sometimes, but God's grace is sufficient. We talked about God's grace this morning and what wonderful things God's grace does for us. The Romans chapter 3 passage, fast forward to Romans chapter 3, and beginning in verse 1. What advantage does the Jew have? Now that's the question that Paul is answering over the next 8 verses or so. I'm not going to read all of that, but he's answering the question, what advantage does the Jew have? He's already said back in chapter 2 that even the Jews are guilty of sin, just as the Gentiles were in chapter 1. Jews are guilty, chapter 2. And so he's answering the question that the Jews would have had. Well, then what advantage does the Jew have? What is the advantage of being a Jew? In verse 5, let's take up in verse 5, because here he begins to really answer the question, but he does it by answering he does it in a hypothetical way. He writes in verse 5, if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, then what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath upon us? I speak in a human way. By no means. For then how could God judge the world? In verse 7, he introduces another hypothetical. And again, if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, then why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil so that good may come, as some people slanderously charge us with saying, and their condemnation is just. We've come through the book of Romans. It's been a while back now, and so I know it's been a long time since we've looked at these verses in a Bible class or anything like that. Paul quite often uses hypotheticals, especially in the book of Romans. If this is the way it is, then what are we going to say about that? For example, in the very next chapter, in chapter 4 and in verse 2, if Abraham was justified by works, he would have something to boast about. His point is, Abraham was not justified by meritorious works. He was not justified by earning his favor with God. Abraham was not justified that way, which is part of the whole argument of the book of Romans. But notice in chapter 4 and verse 2, he introduces that as a hypothetical. If it is true that Abraham was justified by works. Well, it was not true. That's not how Abraham was justified. Come back to chapter 3. He's doing the same thing here. Verse 5, if it is true that our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, that again was the Jewish perception of Jewish advantage. Many of them believe that the answer to the question, what advantage does the Jew have? Well, the advantage that the Jew has is that we are in the club, that we have been circumcised. And because we have this club membership, that we have special standing with God. To them, that was the great advantage to being a Jew. The hypothetical in verse 7 is something similar. If through my lie, again, if it is true that my lie, that is, Paul speaking in terms of his own shortcomings, if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, then why am I still being condemned as a sinner? His point is that this might be the Jewish perception, but this is not an accurate perception of the advantage to being a Jew. Now, at this point, you might be saying, so what does that have to do with 2 Corinthians chapter 12? Well, again, what was the question back in chapter 12? 2 Corinthians chapter 12. The questioner is asking in particular, I didn't have room to put all this on the screen. In particular, when Paul writes that God says my power, his answer to remove this thorn from me. No, I'm not going to do that because my power is made perfect in weakness. The questioner is asking, so doesn't that contradict what he's writing over here in Romans chapter 3? That God's power is made perfect in weakness. My weakness actually demonstrates God's power and God's grace. And so he says, how do you harmonize that? Because Paul seems to be talking about it in a good way there in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and yet he condemns it here in Romans chapter 3. So how do you harmonize those things? Well, I think it's pretty simple, actually. The Jews, again, were using the contrast between their spiritual weakness and God's perfection to justify their sin. And that's a problem. If they're used, again, if it is true that our unrighteousness magnifies the righteousness of God, they were using that to justify their unrighteousness. And Paul would say, that's not right. You can't do that. There's no great advantage to being a Jew. They're not like that. And so that's how they were using it. And that's what Paul is describing in Romans chapter 3. The contrast between their spiritual weakness and God's perfection. But when we look over in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul is using a similar contrast, but here it's the contrast between his physical weakness, my thorn in the flesh, with God's grace. He's not using it in a boastful way at all. Not using it to excuse any kind of spiritual weakness or sin that he might have. He's simply using it to make the point that no matter what physical shortcomings that he has, and I think the lesson for you and me, no matter what physical shortcomings we may have, that God's grace is sufficient, that God's grace can help us to overcome that. That's true for people who are struggling with physical infirmities. It's true as you get into old age. You know, it can become a real struggle as you get older just to deal with the daily problems of life. Well, God's grace is sufficient for us there. And so, not using God's grace as an excuse to sin, why it's okay for us to sin, not at all, but to use it to help us understand the place that suffering has in our lives. It is, I think, a source of great comfort for anybody who has been struggling. Good question.